A single shortage of grain in Rome was more terrifying to an emperor than a barbarian army at the gates. This is how they weaponized bread to hold the world together. Imagine the Subura at high noon. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and unwashed stone. Above, the sun beats down on a labyrinth of crumbling tenements, but in the streets, you know the temperature is rising for a different reason. A murmur ripples through the crowd, a low, guttural vibration that warns of an approaching storm. It is not the roar of a conquering legion, but the desperate, hollow-bellied growl of a city that has realized the grain ships from Alexandria are late. For the ordinary Roman citizen, the empire wasn't defined by the marble columns of the Senate or the gilded armor of the Praetorian Guard. It was defined by the anana, the state's subsidized grain supply. To the mob, the emperor was not a god nor a political strategist. He was simply the provider of the daily ration. When that supply chain stuttered, the veneer of civilization began to peel away. In the shadows of the cramped alleyways, the tension is palpable. Shopkeepers begin to board their windows, and the wine shops fall silent. Every man knows the truth, right? If the ships don't dock, the city burns. A hungry populace does not care for the complexities of Mediterranean storms or administrative incompetence in distant provinces. They care only for the heavy, coarse loaf that separates them from starvation. The Roman state understood this vulnerability better than any other. They knew that their vast, sprawling dominion was held together by a fragile thread of wheat. It was a high-stakes gamble played out on the open sea, where a single sinking vessel or a week of adverse winds could turn an emperor into a target for assassination. Behind the majesty of the Colosseum and the glory of the triumphs lay the terrifying reality that the Roman peace was merely a meal away from total anarchy. The granary was the true heart of the empire, and its pulse dictated the life and death of dynasties. We are taught to see Rome through the lens of iron and ambition, We gaze upon the colossal sun-bleached marble statues of Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius, and we are conditioned to believe that their legacies were carved entirely by the sharpened steel of the legions. We imagine the empire as a monolithic, self-sustaining fortress, anchored by the discipline of soldiers who could hold back the tides of history with nothing more than a pilum and a shield. But that is the myth, a tale carefully curated to obscure a much more fragile, pulse-quickening reality. Beneath the polished facade of the Forum, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and the constant echoing shouts of orators, the city breathed not in military glory, but in hunger. Rome was an insatiable beast. To keep the heart of this vast, sprawling empire beating, it required a staggering 200,000 tons of grain every single year. This was not a luxury, it was the baseline for survival. If the flow of wheat from the golden fields of Egypt and North Africa faltered for even a fortnight, the marble veneer of civilization would crack, and the city would descend into a fever of riots and blood. The legions were the muscle, yes. They secured the borders and expanded the reaches of the map. But a sword has no purpose if the hand that wields it is shaking from malnutrition, right? A city that cannot feed its millions will inevitably devour its own leaders from within. The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, was never truly enforced by the sword alone. It was sustained by the steady, rhythmic arrival of grain ships at the port of Ostia.
This brings us to a chilling realization that historians often overlook. If the legions were the iron fist that Rome displayed to the world, what was the unseen, delicate heart that, if stopped, would have caused the entire empire to collapse into dust within a matter of days? There was a mechanism hidden in plain sight, a lifeline so vital that emperors were willing to commit atrocities just to keep it pumping. And yet, there is a specific, devastating secret about how they managed this supply chain, a manipulation so cunning that it turned the entire populace into silent, unwilling accomplices to their own absolute control. But that is where the narrative shifts from simple logistics to something far more calculated. The heart of the Roman Empire did not beat in the Senate House or within the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill. It beat in the rhythmic thrum of grain ships carving through the Mediterranean, a relentless, life-sustaining pulse controlled by a bureaucracy that viewed hunger as the ultimate political weapon. This was the Annona, a logistical marvel so complex it bordered on the divine, managed by architects of supply who understood that, to feed the Roman mob was to own the Roman soul. These bureaucrats were the unseen puppeteers of the Mediterranean. They didn't just move wheat, right? They moved power. By formalizing the grain dole, the state effectively transformed a volatile, starving population into a dependent class. Every loaf of bread distributed in the forum was a silent reminder: the emperor is your provider, and to turn against him, well, is to invite the shadow of starvation back into your home. But the true genius and the most chilling aspect of this system lay in the treatment of Egypt. To the Roman eye, Egypt was not merely a province to be governed, it was the personal, guarded stomach of the emperor. While other provinces were governed by the Senate, Egypt was treated as the private estate of the Caesar himself. No Roman senator was even permitted to set foot on Egyptian soil with the express written permission of the emperor, a restriction that speaks volumes about the level of paranoia involved. They knew that if an ambitious general could seize the Nile's bounty, they could starve Rome into submission in a matter of weeks. The logistics were handled with a level of cold mathematical precision that haunts the modern imagination. Thousands of tons of grain were meticulously accounted for, taxed, stored in massive state-owned granaries, and shipped under the watchful gaze of imperial agents who left nothing to chance. It was an obsession with supply chain security that would make a modern logistics expert weep with envy. I mean, it really is staggering. Yet, as sophisticated as these architects were, there was a fatal vulnerability in their design. They had managed to turn the entire Mediterranean into a single interconnected organ, but by centralizing the food supply so absolutely, they had created a terrifyingly fragile dependence. The state had become so efficient at preventing the people from starving that they had forgotten what happens when that supply line is finally, inevitably severed. But that is where the narrative shifts from simple administration to a desperate, hidden struggle for survival that history books rarely mention. Why did they truly fear the shifting tides of the Mediterranean winds? And what desperate measures did they take when the grain ships failed to arrive?
The survival of Rome was never just a matter of legions and cold, hard steel. No, it was a matter of logistics, written in the ink-stained ledger books of the grain masters. To secure the heart of the empire, the emperors looked toward the mouth of the Tiber, transforming a quiet coastal town into the ironclad choke point of the ancient world, Ostia. Imagine the sheer scale of it. Massive, man-made harbors carved from the shifting sands, where ships, laden with Egyptian wheat, were funneled into the state's waiting hands. By concentrating the entire supply chain into one highly monitored port, the state ensured that no grain moved, no loaf was baked, and no belly was filled without the emperor's own stamp of approval. It was a masterpiece of tactical control. If the grain moved, the city lived. If it stopped, the city fell silent. But this was far more than simple distribution, right? This was the grain dole, a sophisticated psychological weapon that turned the volatile, hungry masses of Rome into a dependent electorate. Every month, thousands of citizens would gather in the shadow of the marble monuments, clutching their tokens, waiting for the state to provide their sustenance. It was a brilliant, gilded bribe. By keeping the population perpetually fed by the hand of the Caesar, the emperors effectively neutered the threat of civil unrest. I mean, why march on the palace when the palace provides your daily bread? The logic was cold and absolute. A hungry mob is a mob with nothing to lose, but a fed mob, that is a mob with everything to fear from the loss of the state. It transformed the relationship between ruler and ruled into a delicate, suffocating dance of survival. The state didn't just govern, it acted as the sole provider, a divine patron holding the keys to the pantry of the world. Yet this system had a shadow, one that stretched long and thin over the Roman Forum. What of those who refused to play the game? What of the voices that dared to whisper against this manufactured dependency? The history books speak of the grain, but they are often deafeningly silent on the fate of those who tried to disrupt the supply chain. When a shipment failed, or when a grain merchant dared to withhold his stock, the response was not administrative, it was absolute. But what exactly was the price of challenging the emperor's monopoly? And why did the Roman authorities go to such terrifying lengths to keep the true cost of that wheat hidden from the common citizen? That, my friends, is a secret buried even deeper in the silt of the Tiber. The year is 69 AD, and the Mediterranean is not merely a sea, it is the colossal juggernaut that keeps Rome alive. But even the mightiest empire can be brought to its knees. Emperor Vitellius, a man whose grip on power was as tenuous as the rotting hulls of his own grain fleet, faced a nightmare that every Roman leader feared: the silent port. When the grain shipments from Alexandria stalled, the atmosphere in Rome shifted from mundane irritation to a suffocating, visceral panic. You see, the Roman populace did not see politics, they felt the gnawing ache of hunger, and hunger, in the streets of the Eternal City, is the fastest catalyst for revolution.
Vitellius knew that to lose the grain supply was to lose his head. When merchant ship owners, sensing a golden opportunity to inflate their prices during the shortage, began to withhold their cargo at the docks of Ostia, the emperor did not engage in diplomacy. He did not negotiate. He responded with the cold, calculated violence that defined the imperial survival instinct. The docks, usually filled with the rhythmic chant of porters and the creak of timber, suddenly fell into an eerie, blood-soaked silence. Merchants were rounded up in the dead of night. Their ledgers, the sacred accounts of the supply chain, were seized, scrutinized, and then turned to ash. Those who resisted were not merely fined, they were made into examples, their lives extinguished to ensure the rest of the guild understood a singular, brutal truth. The grain did not belong to them, it belonged to the state, and the state belonged to the emperor. This wasn't just about feeding the masses, it was a grand demonstration of absolute control. By eliminating the middleman through sheer force, Vitellius briefly stabilized the supply, but the cost was immense. The systemic fear he instilled shattered the fragile trust between the merchants and the crown. It created a ripple effect, an instability that would eventually cost Vitellius his life when the legions of the East chose to abandon him for a new commander. Yet as the smoke cleared from the burning docks, a terrifying realization dawned on the Roman elite. They had saved the city from starvation, right? But they had also exposed the deepest fracture in the Roman machine. If the emperor's power began and ended at the port walls, what happened when the merchants simply stopped believing in the emperor's ability to protect them? But that brings us to a much darker question, because while the history books focus on the grain, they gloss over the shipments that never arrived at all, shipments that were not lost to storms, but to something far more calculated. Was there a hidden hand orchestrating these failures from within the Senate itself, waiting for the perfect moment to starve the emperor into submission? The fall of Rome was never a singular thunderous collapse under the weight of barbarian blades. It was in truth a long, agonizing silence, a slow, painful fading of the lights. You know, the city of 7 hills lived by the grace of a single umbilical cord, the golden grain ships of Egypt. When that lifeline was finally severed, the empire did not just lose a province, it lost its ability to exist. We often imagine the end of Rome as a battlefield strewn with iron and broken shields, but look closer at the grain riots of the later centuries, and you will see the true face of the collapse. When the Vandals seized the North African coast, they did not just occupy land, they seized the throttle of the Roman heart. They understood what the Caesars had known for centuries, that to control the wheat was to control the throne. As the ports of Alexandria and Carthage fell into chaos, the great stone granaries of Rome began to echo with a hollow, terrifying sound. The complex logistical web, the tack ships, the inspectors, the imperial navies that once patrolled the Mediterranean like a private lake, simply evaporated.
The bread dole, the very mechanism that kept a million citizens from tearing the city apart, dried up. Imagine the scene. The markets of the Forum, once vibrant with the scent of olive oil and fresh grain, falling into an eerie, desperate quiet. The nobility fled to their fortified villas in the countryside, leaving the urban masses to face a phantom enemy, starvation.
The empire became a ghost of its former self, a giant with a hollow stomach. The legions, once fueled by the steady pulse of supply lines, found themselves fighting for food rather than borders. I mean, think about that. The breadbasket of the ancient world had been transformed into a battlefield, and in that transition, the administrative genius of Rome finally met its match. The state could no longer project power because it could no longer feed its own pulse. But was this truly a strategic military failure, or was there a deeper, more treacherous collapse occurring within the very foundations of the imperial supply chain? There is a lingering mystery concerning the final shipments that disappeared into the fog of the Mediterranean, vessels that seem to have vanished even before the barbarians reached the docks. Did the Roman elite sabotage their own lifeline to ensure their personal survival? And if so, who else was pulling the strings in the dark? The vanishing of those final grain fleets was not merely a logistical anomaly. You see, it was the chilling sound of a civilization fracturing under its own weight. When the wheat stopped flowing, the illusion of eternal Rome dissolved into the cold reality of a starving populace. The empire had built a machine so vast and so interconnected that it became paralyzed by its own scale. Those ships that disappeared into the Mediterranean fog were the final heartbeat of a dying giant, a stark reminder that even the most formidable power on Earth is only ever a few missed deliveries away from total collapse. We often look at the ruins of the Forum or the shattered columns of the Parthenon and see only the grandeur of marble and myth. Yet, beneath that stone lies a fragile, hidden architecture of supply and demand that dictated the rise and fall of every Caesar and king. The Romans were masters of the world, right? But they were also slaves to the next harvest. They understood that to control the belly of the citizen was to control the destiny of the state. It is a lesson that echoes across the millennia, finding a restless home in our modern, globalized world. Today, we stand in the center of a web far more complex than anything the ancient world could have imagined. Our shelves are stocked by thousands of invisible hands across thousands of miles, and we trust, perhaps too implicitly, in the systems that bring us everything from the grain in our bread to the technology in our pockets. But just as it was in Rome, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. When that link snaps, whether through war, climate, or political sabotage, the buffer between order and absolute chaos thins to nothing. The fall of Rome was not a single dramatic explosion. It was a slow, quiet unraveling, starting in the logistics rooms and the dark corners of the grain ports. It is the ultimate truth of history. Power does not die with a sword. It dies when the supply chain is severed. As you go about your day, look at the world around you. Beneath the glass and steel of our modern cities, the same ancient mechanics are at play. Are we any more secure than the citizens of Rome? Or are we simply more comfortable in our fragility? If you found yourself gripped by this glimpse into the secret gears of history, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories buried in the dust of the past, waiting to reveal the mechanics of the world we live in today. Leave a comment below. In our hyper-connected age, which part of our global supply chain do you think is the most vulnerable to a total collapse? Let's unravel the mystery together.